In the early 90s, Nintendo and Sega's consoles were rapidly battling it out in the console race, which was impressive considering none of the consoles had wheels. A partnership had been formed between Nintendo and Sony, thanks to the work of Ken Kutaragi, a man named after his mother's fondness for British comedian Ken Dodd and Kentucky Fried Chicken. Nintendo and Sony had been working together on the Super Nintendo, and were becoming a bit of a tag team. A bit like that time Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage teamed up, except less racist and less dead.
Oh yeah!
And just as the Mega Powers imploded, so did the relationship between Sony and Nintendo. Nintendo had realised if they were not careful, Sony would end up with too much power, and so Nintendo went and cheated on Sony with some bloke called Philip. After being publicly embarrassed, Sony wanted revenge, and what better way to get revenge than to make their own console, to rival Nintendo and their rivals' rivals, Sega. Sony decided to make a 3D console rather than a 2D one, mainly because a 2D console would have been flat like a picture and wouldn't have been able to play games. Sony had realised that in the olden days, gamers were tortured with games that were only in 2D, so they decided they'd make the leap from 2D games to 3D games, which is 1D better. The graphics might look crap now, but back then they were so cutting edge, some claimed you could even get cut on them from space. Initially the console was nicknamed the PSX, which is an abbreviation of PSX. Sony knew the PSX would need games, and they couldn't just pop down to Tesco or download them like you can now. Sony needed developers who could make them games, and they were helped by an unlikely source. No, not Heinz. Sony were helped by a dinosaur. The dinosaur developed a demo of itself, which developers described as ultra-realistic, to the point that one claimed the dinosaur assaulted them. Developers were impressed with the power of Sony's machine, and the assault. Eventually, Sony dropped the X from the PSX, and instead called it the PS, or as it's commonly known now, the PlayStation. Sony had unveiled its vision. It was pretty clear, and in 3D. Its PlayStation would also utilise CDs, which are a bit like the granddad of Blu-rays. Not only were they cheaper than cartridges, they could also fit more data in them, which is impressive considering how much thinner they are than cartridges. Sony also painted them black, mainly because they thought it looked cool, and also hoped it would deter pirates, who were notorious for liking video games and not having to pay for them. What the PlayStation didn't have was a hard drive. Instead, they'd make people pay to save their games by purchasing a memory card. A memory card was a bit of a joke name, as they had such little memory they wouldn't even be able to fit a single MP3. Third-party options were also available, often cheaper, and coming with their own unique feature of randomly wiping your saves for a laugh. Eventually, the PlayStation was released between 1994 and 1995, depending where in the world you lived, if you lived at all at that point. The launch was a success. Even if it didn't make it into space, it did make it into people's homes, unlike the Saturn. Despite sounding like some sort of sex device, the PlayStation was selling incredibly well, as were the games. Some of the early releases included Ridge Racer, a game in which you drive as fast as you can without crashing. Destruction Derby, a game where you drive as fast as you can whilst crashing. And Tekken, a game in which you inflict brain damage onto a guy dressed as a jaguar. Sega released their own 3D console, named the Sega Saturn. Well, that's what historians believe. It's claimed that people were so disinterested in the console, no one documented any of it. One argument for the console's failure was that Sonic struggled with the transition to 3D, which left the little hedgehog depressed, and he remains blue to this day. Games continue to help Sony reach new heights with the PlayStation, with seemingly no way down, as it doesn't have any legs to use stairs. Resident Evil was a game so scary, people are still horrified by the dialogue, controls, and graphics today. Tomb Raider was a game about an archaeologist who spends their time searching for ancient artifacts whilst engaging in casual murder. If it sounds a bit like an Indiana Jones ripoff, that's because it is. But Tomb Raider did feature a female protagonist called Lara Croft, who became a cultural phenomenon, advertising everything from Lucasade to dangerous driving and even kidnapping. It all fed into Sony's marketing strategy, which was not to sell games to gamers. That may sound stupid, because it is, but it also isn't. Sony knew that normal people were put off by advertising, and so instead used something called underground marketing, supported by Wombles. Sony wanted to destigmatize video games and make the PlayStation cool, which meant shying away from the ways in which other game companies would prey on kids. Instead, Sony was interested in 20-somethings with disposable income and too much time to know what to do with. Sony wanted an older, more sophisticated audience, so they targeted ravers. Now, Sony didn't target ravers with a weapon due to fears of violence, so instead they targeted them with marketing. Sony put PlayStation pods throughout nightclubs in the UK, so ravers could get some respite from dancing to music that sounds like a headache feels. One of the games featured in these nightclubs was the futuristic racing sim Wipeout, a game that featured much of the music that ravers were listening to in the clubs, meaning they could play the game at home, but without the dancing like an idiot whilst drugged up and trying to eat their own face. Sony even created drug paraphernalia with the PlayStation logo at a Glastonbury festival, a flyer with serrated sections that could be used as a roach for spliffs, and included the slogan, "More powerful than God." Luckily, the slogan didn't offend any religious groups, except Muslims, who threatened Sony with a fatwa. But Sony probably liked a fat one after the stunt they pulled. Still, they wanted to create a buzz, and it worked, in more ways than one. Sony demonstrated you didn't need to spend millions on advertising, despite also spending millions on advertising. That included TV advertising, but these ads were often controversial and confusing, including this one where they threw a PlayStation in the bin and forced a chimp to play Ridge Racer. Another advert was the artistic Double Life, and you know it's artistic because it's in black and white. Despite the advert winning awards, Sony were disappointed when they realised they forgot to include any game footage in the ad itself, so people had no bloody clue what the advert was promoting. Nintendo tried to compete. They even tried their own edgy TV advert for their new N64 console, where Mario kidnaps a kid who's been missing ever since. Sega even tried to tell everyone that the PlayStation couldn't do 3D like the Saturn could do 3D, but literally no one cared. Though Sega did release a game called Nights, a game about the absence of light during evenings. But it was Sony's games that were reigning supreme. Crash Bandicoot became an unofficial mascot for the PlayStation, and even threatened Mario at one point, until he was arrested. Gran Turismo came out, and despite how slow and boring it looks now, at the time it was so realistic that the police would often break into people's homes and arrest people for speeding and drink driving offences. One of the biggest releases on the PlayStation was Final Fantasy VII, a game that tells you it's okay to join a terrorist organisation as long as you're paid, or at least doing it for a cute girl. The Womble's underground marketing strategy was working, as the coolness of the PlayStation spread by word of mouth, a bit like herpes. The PlayStation was becoming mainstream. There was even PlayStation branded clothing in magazines, which is helpful as it tells people what's cool, otherwise they'd have no idea. The PlayStation became the console to own, unless you already owned it, and Sony couldn't stop releasing quality games, including Metal Gear Solid, where you play as a covert operative who hides in boxes and gets pissed on by wolves. There was also Resident Evil 2, which was a bit like the first Resident Evil, but now inside a police station. Dino Crisis, which was a little bit like Resident Evil, but with dinosaurs. And Silent Hill, which is a bit like Resident Evil, but scary. In Silent Hill, you play as an adult man looking for his female child in a town full of vapours. With the success of many of the games, sequels soon became so common it was almost included into the social class system. So many games were being released with a number 2 on the end, they ended up trying to change things up by releasing some games with other numbers on the end, like Tomb Raider 3 and even Final Fantasy 8. The PlayStation kept making money, so they made it smaller and it still kept making money, until eventually it died of old age and was replaced by its sequel.
Welcome to the third place.
The PlayStation was the first console to sell over 100 million units. Nintendo lost a considerable market share, and Sega were on life support, just waiting on someone to pull the plug. Some have suggested that Sega Saturn failed as consumers were confused by the name, unsure how they'd fit one of the largest planets in the solar system into their living room. Some believe that the Sega Saturn was a stupid name anyway, though many people still argue to this day the Saturn has a ring to it. The PlayStation remains loved to this day, which is why no one bothered with the PlayStation Classic. You might look back at these games and think, they don't look that great, but back in the olden days when this console came out, they looked then just like they do now. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out another video like one of these. If we inspired you to check out the PlayStation yourself and play some of the classic games we mentioned, don't bother, just wait for the remake. There's probably 3 on the way this week alone. Bye bye!